I'll give you the thumb.
You'll give me the thumb, okay.
So we're on here now, but nobody on the radio can hear you just yet.
Well, I'll look good.
Okay, for sure.
I'll put on my good look face.
Let me see if I can get it. Orientation's locked. Okay, that's fine.
See myself, huh?
He needs our help.
Hey y'all, this is Mark G, Abolitionist, on the air with you at KEXU 96.1 FM LP, Revolution Radio, where we explore the connection between imperial war and imperial conquest. I don't limit myself to being a prison abolitionist, because there are more structures and institutions that I seek to abolish than just incarceration. For example, white supremacy and racism, two different things. Male supremacy and patriarchy, two different things. Class supremacy and wage oppression, two different things. And imperial war. Yes, imperial war is an institution of the American empire. But let me be very clear. The United States military is an institution of the American empire, as we all know. However, it serves the institution of imperial war. The need for imperial conquest shapes and defines the U.S. military. In fact, the European lust and need for conquest of Indian lands made the development of a military necessary. All who resisted or opposed were killed or imprisoned. The first reservations were in fact prisons. I'm going to talk about Vietnam a little bit. Y'all make sure you also hear Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine, and any and every inner city in America. He was a 9 or 10-year-old boy begging for food on the side of the road like hundreds of others. I was riding shotgun in a truck. I was the one with the gun. The driver crushed his skull with a can of sea rations. I was cruising at 1,500 feet, keeping my mind and body clear and cool, a hellbound fool, mindful if you will, and that chopper landed for fuel. 5 men got on, 3 gooks, 2 Americans, 2 gooks tied up right. When we got up oh so high, 2 gooks don't talk. They threw one in the sky. 2 little vignettes about experiences that I had in Vietnam. I have been asked why I use the derogatory term gook in this piece. And I use the term because I'm trying to be authentic and keep it real. That's the language we use in Vietnam, and it expresses the attitude. When I talk about 3 gooks getting on the helicopter and 2 of them being tied up, one of those Vietnamese was a member of the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam. the army that fought with the Americans. But I refer to 3 Gooks because I want to make it clear that we Americans made no distinction between the Vietnamese, those who supported and wanted the Americans there, and those who opposed the Americans being there. We made no distinction between them. So that's why I continue to use that language. I think it's important that the racism, the white supremacy that we have ideologically within us and that we bring to practical bear is important to maintain the authentic view of. We're going to continue our discussion about imperial war and its relation to incarceration. Last week, we talked about the landing of the Pilgrims. We talked about the landing of the Dutch in New York. We talked about the incidents that the Pilgrims perpetrated 15 years after their colony was settled. We talked about the atrocities of the Dutch from the parapets on their wall that they built on the island of Manhattan. We're going to move a little bit further west now. As the United States developed and moved westward, it moved westward with its military, destroying Indian civilizations and cultures, imposing military rule, and setting up a reservation system. The reservations were prisons. There's no other way to talk about them. People were forced to live in certain areas. They were not allowed to hunt. They were not allowed to leave the reservation. The food that they had, the clothing, the blankets that they had were supplied by the United States military, or the lack thereof of those things, as well as the distribution of infected blankets that were used to carry out biological germ warfare against the indigenous peoples of North America. These things happened, and they continue to happen. There is some controversy. We all hear very well and are aware of the distribution of blankets infected with smallpox among the tribes. I don't ascribe to that. It doesn't make sense to me. I think what was done was blankets infected with chickenpox and or measles were distributed, carrying out a campaign of biological and bacterial warfare against indigenous peoples. I don't think it was smallpox, because smallpox also wiped out the Europeans. And the standard practice of Europeans, Americans at this point, in the West, was to burn anything that was infected with smallpox. Entire towns were burned. So there wouldn't have been materials to hold and collect and distribute and disseminate among the tribes. Besides that, who would they get to haul the blankets and hand the blankets out? Because smallpox infected and wiped out European people also. Measles and chickenpox is much more likely, because measles and chickenpox did not have the same devastating effects on the Europeans as it had on the indigenous peoples, who had no resistance to the diseases that were brought to this country by the European peoples from Europe. In California, in 1849, remember the 49ers? When gold was found at Sutter's Mill? Not that far from where we are right now in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was illegal to be indigenous. It was illegal to be an Indian. An indigenous person could be killed on sight. There were bounties, as there were in colonial times on the East Coast, on the lives of indigenous people. The gold miners who worked their camps during the week would form together in posses and go out hunting and killing indigenous people to claim the bounty. The incarceration rate for indigenous people in America continues to be staggering. High percentages of indigenous people fill the prisons in the prisons of the western states. This continues as it was initiated in the 17 and 1800s, and it continues today. Incarceration, prisons were concepts that the original people on these lands did not have. They had no word for prison. They could not conceive of locking people away in cages. And it was difficult for indigenous people to conceive of being restricted to areas, geographic areas that were inhospitable, that were difficult to live in, unable to hunt sufficiently to feed themselves, unable to hunt sufficiently to provide the implements and the tools and the clothing that were necessary to live, forcing the people into a dependence on their conquerors, on the United States military. The Bureau of Indian Affairs managed these prisons. The Bureau of Indian Affairs continues to manage these prisons. The reservations today continue to be restrictive areas. People who live on them are not citizens of the United States. People who are enrolled in indigenous tribes, of sovereign tribes, are not citizens of the United States. An indigenous person, to become a citizen of the United States, they must leave the reservation and they must go through an application process. And they must become a naturalized citizen. They must give up their place in their tribe, in their community. They must forsake it. These are brutal conditions that are forced upon people. Next week, we're going to get a little bit more into the more modern aspects and relationships between imperial war and incarceration, and we'll discuss more about imperial war. In closing, I want to talk just a little bit about Palestine. Palestine is was a country on the Mediterranean Sea. It's in the area that we commonly refer to as the Middle East. Since 1949, Palestine has ceased to exist, and the country of Israel exists on the geography that once was Palestine. The people who lived there before the Europeans came, Europeans who practiced the Jewish religion, were referred to as Palestinians. People who trace their heritage to that continue to refer to themselves as Palestinians. There were Palestinians who practiced Islam. There were Palestinians who practiced Christianity. And there were Palestinians who practiced Judaism. All three religious groupings existed harmoniously amongst each other, amongst the land of Palestine. It was the advent of the concept of Zionism and the expression of Zionist imperial designs for land that developed Israel. Israel is an imperial state. As such, Israel has usurped land from Palestinian peoples since its inception, its entire history. Israel comes into being in 1949. It's an imperial settler nation. Palestinian people have been driven from their lands. Palestinian people have been forced to live in two main areas, the West Bank of the Jordan River and the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is the largest open-air prison in the world. We're going to go into that specific detail in greater detail in the coming weeks. Right now, I'm going to close out. This is Mark G. Abolitionist on the air with you saying, we are the ones we're waiting for. Please join with me. All of us are none. Prisoners of the Conscience Committee, formerly incarcerated and convicted people and families movement. And we say, well, what's the call? Free them all. Dare to struggle. Dare to win. All power to the people. We say, Ashe. Make sure you get enough rest. That's real important. You know, and I'm working through my mind because we've got one more week, and then it's going to be dark. You know, so I'm trying to work myself, see how I feel about what I'm going to do, come in and, you know, and work in the studio. I'm not comfortable with it. We'll see what's happening. We'll figure something.